It is becoming clearer to people around the world that the United States has been losing the war against Iran, which the US itself started. And this is being discussed not only in foreign countries, but also in Washington, D.C. Today I'm going to be explaining how neoconservative war hawks in Washington, who were architects of the Iraq War and the wars on Libya and Syria, and who for years advocated for war on Iran, have now reluctantly admitted that the US is losing this war, and it's going to have massive geopolitical repercussions on the entire world, leading to the weakening of the US empire, and not only the strengthening of Iran, but also other countries, including China, Russia, and the global south as a whole. Now, independent anti-war voices like us have already been saying this, but what's incredible is it's now being acknowledged even by warmongers in Washington, D.C., again, who are some of the architects of the Iraq War, like this man I'm showing an image of right now. I'll be discussing who exactly he is and what he's saying in a minute or two here. But a brief summary of his argument is that the US is losing this war against Iran, and this loss is going to have an even bigger geopolitical impact than the US loss in the wars against Vietnam and Afghanistan, and this will transform global geopolitics and will strengthen the position of China and Russia and the global south more broadly, and the role of the US will be weakened around the world. So in a moment here, I'm going to go into further detail and explain who the author of the article was. But first, I want to answer the question, why are pro-war neoconservative hawks in Washington admitting this fact? And I think it's quite clear. It's because they can see the writing on the wall. They can see that Trump is extremely unpopular, especially because of this war, but also because of inflation and the cost of living crisis and corruption. But this war has really hurt Trump's popularity even more. And polls show that the vast majority of Americans, at least 60%, and some polls show an even higher percentage of Americans, oppose this war. So now I want to spend a moment briefly explaining the context and how the discourse surrounding the Iran war has evolved in the past few weeks. Now, the US and Israel launched this war of aggression on the 28th of February, and a month later, the British newspaper The Independent acknowledged that Iran was the clear winner, as Trump's desperate bid to end the war shows that he's desperately looking for an off-ramp. This was the foreign media. European media outlets started to acknowledge after a month that the US was losing. Then in mid-April, some US corporate media outlets started to acknowledge that the war was not going well. The Wall Street Journal published an op-ed titled, "For now at least, the Iran war seems to be failing." And this was written by the former editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, who was previously a major supporter of Donald Trump, although he later turned against Trump. Meanwhile, US intelligence agencies have been feeding information to US media outlets acknowledging that the war has been going very badly. The New York Times reported this May that US intelligence shows that Iran still has the vast majority of its missile capabilities. Iran has operational access to 30 of its 33 missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is the narrow strait off the coast of Iran, and it's the world's most important oil transit choke point. Before this war, about 20% of the globally traded oil supply passed through this narrow strait on a daily basis. Iran had initially closed down access to the Strait of Hormuz in response to the US-Israeli war of aggression, although Iran has allowed ships from China and Russia and India and countries that it considers to be friendly countries, their ships are allowed to pass through the strait. This angered Washington, so Trump declared a U.S. naval blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. However, U.S. intelligence officials also admitted in an article published by the Washington Post that Iran will be able to withstand this U.S. military blockade of the Strait of Hormuz for many months. Iran actually has leverage. Iran has an advantage here, whereas the U.S. is the country that is not able to maintain this blockade for so long, especially when you consider the fact that Trump's war of aggression has caused the largest oil crisis in history, and this is causing a global economic crisis and a food crisis because many farmers cannot get access to the fertilizers they need to grow food. And then finally, U.S. intelligence officials admitted to the media that Iran has succeeded in defending itself and destroying or heavily damaging the majority of U.S. military bases in the region, in West Asia, also known as the Middle East. Trump, of course, denied this, but the fact that U.S. intelligence officials are leaking so much to the media is a reflection of the fact that this war is obviously going extremely badly. And Trump and his top cabinet members will go out and claim that they're winning the war. But all of these leaks from these U.S. intelligence officials clearly demonstrate that the exact opposite is happening. So now, with all of that context established, I want to discuss the main point of this analysis today, which is that even some neoconservative war hawks in the U.S., who were architects of the Iraq War, who have supported every U.S. war for decades, even they are now getting cold feet, and they are lamenting that Washington is losing this war, Tehran is winning, and it will change the world. This was admitted in The Atlantic magazine, which is a neoconservative publication. It supports Atlanticism, the idea that the West should be this unified imperialist bloc of Europe and the US, unified by the military alliance NATO that ensures US imperial dominance of the entire world. The Atlantic represents neoliberal free market economics. It represents the interests of large corporations, US corporations. It represents the interests of the military industrial complex and US dominated organizations like NATO and the IMF and the World Bank. That's the ideology of The Atlantic magazine. And yet, The Atlantic published a surprising article titled "Checkmate in Iran," and it's subtitled "Washington Cannot Reverse or Control the Consequences of Losing This War." And the author of this shockingly honest article is none other than Robert Kagan. He is one of the most influential foreign policy thinkers in the US. He is a notorious neoconservative war hawk who was one of the original advocates for the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. Now, Robert Kagan was one of the co-founders of one of the most influential think tanks in Washington called the Project for the New American Century, or PNAC. That is P-N-A-C, PNAC. Members of PNAC included top officials in the George W. Bush administration, like Dick Cheney, who was Bush's vice president, and Paul Wolfowitz, who was Deputy Secretary of Defense under Bush and the president of the World Bank, along with neocons like John Bolton, who was actually brought back by Donald Trump in his first administration to be National Security Advisor. If you look at a list of the founding signatories of the Project for the New American Century, you can see it included nearly a dozen top members of the George W. Bush administration, and some of them later went on to join the Trump administration and became Trump supporters, like Elliott Abrams and Frank Gaffney. Also, Jeb Bush, the Florida politician from the Bush family who ran for president, he was one of the original PNAC signatories. And Francis Fukuyama, who wrote the infamous book The End of History and the Last Man after the overthrow of the Soviet Union in 1991, in which he argued that US-style capitalist liberal democracy would be the final stage of human evolution, and every country would eventually adopt this kind of US neoliberal capitalist system. So the point is that these neoconservatives, or neocons, were extremely influential in the 1990s and 2000s. Again, they filled top positions in the US government under George W. Bush, and many people argued that Dick Cheney, who was vice president under Bush Jr., was essentially the shadow president. Bush was more of a figurehead, and Cheney was working behind the scenes to make many of the decisions, including the invasion of Iraq. And by the way, it's not a coincidence that Dick Cheney had previously been the CEO of the oil corporation Halliburton, which made a killing off of the war in Iraq. It reaped in billions and billions of dollars in profits. But it's important to understand what exactly neoconservatism is. The way that they portray it is that the US should be the global policeman and the US should protect so-called freedom and democracy all around the world and spread liberal democracy by carrying out regime change and carrying out wars to overthrow illiberal regimes. That's the nice-sounding propaganda narrative. In reality, the neocons are blatant imperialists and neocolonialists who are proud of the fact that the US runs a global empire. They think that's a good thing, and that the US should not actually be the policeman of the world, because then the US would have to consistently follow the law, although there are many corrupt police officers. But in reality, they think that the US should be the global emperor, the global dictator that should overthrow any government it doesn't like. Their narrative is that this is about freedom and democracy. What they won't admit is this is actually about the interests of large corporations. And all of these neocons have been funded by big billionaire capitalist oligarchs, and their think tanks in Washington are funded by the military-industrial complex. They are gangsters of capital. They represent the interests of large capitalists, big billionaire oligarchs, and massive monopolistic US corporations that use the US military and try to overthrow any independent government that challenges the global dictatorship of US imperialism. That is what neoconservatism actually represents.